The Galactic Empire stretched across the stars, its reach as infinite as the darkness of space itself. It was a force that knew no mercy, ruled by iron-fisted officials who crushed dissent with an efficiency that made rebellion nearly impossible. Planets once teeming with life now bore the scars of imperial conquest. Burnt cities, silenced voices, and people too afraid to dream of freedom. On the outer rim of the Empire's vast dominion, nestled between jagged mountains and the ruins of old civilizations, lay Vela 5, a once thriving agricultural colony, reduced a little more than a holding pen for imperial laborers. The people here toiled under the burden of endless taxes, their harvest seized by the Empire's forces, leaving them with just enough to survive but never enough to resist. Among them lived Avelini, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering love. She had once known peace, a time when her husband's laughter filled her modest home, when the fields stretched golden beneath a sun untainted by the Empire's shadow. But war had stolen him from her, and now she was alone with her son, Run, a boy of barely 12, whose eyes still carried the innocence of youth despite the harshness of their world. Avelini worked from dawn to dusk, mending uniforms for the Empire's soldiers, while secretly providing aid to those who had lost everything. She was careful, never reckless, but the weight of injustice had settled deep in her bones. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, yet she refused to turn her back on those who suffered around her. Rin watched her with admiration, though he didn't fully understand the risk she took. He spent his days studying in the small learning hall the Empire still allowed, but he saw the weariness in his mother's face when she thought he wasn't looking. He noticed the way she glanced over her shoulder when they walked through the marketplace, how she tensed whenever Imperial patrols passed by. One evening, as they shared a rare meal of bread and dried fruit, Rin hesitated before speaking. "Mother, why do they take so much from us?" His voice was quiet, but beneath it lay a question that had been growing inside him for months. Avelini sighed, reaching out to brush his dark hair from his forehead. "Because they fear us," she said. "Not as we are now, but for what we could become if we stopped being afraid of them." Rin frowned. "But they have ships, weapons. We don't." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Weapons don't make them strong, my love. They control through fear. The moment people stop fearing them, their power crumbles." Her words stayed with Rin long after the candles had burned low. He didn't yet understand the depth of her defiance, but he knew one thing. His mother was the bravest person he had ever known. Hashtag the Empire's grip tightens. The next morning, as the twin suns of Vela 5 rose over the horizon, the village was thrown into chaos. Imperial soldiers, clad in their gleaming black armor, stormed through the narrow streets, their presence a storm cloud blotting out the light. Word spread quickly. There had been a rebellion on a neighboring planet, and the Empire suspected sympathizers among the outer colonies. Avelini's heart pounded as she pulled Rin close, watching from the shadows of their small home. Soldiers dragged men from their houses, interrogating them with a cruelty that had become all too familiar. Women wept as their husbands were taken, and children clung to their mothers, their cries swallowed by the heavy boots of the Empire's enforcers. She knew this was only the beginning. That night, she met with a small group of villagers in the depths of the old marketplace, where the Empire's patrols were less frequent. Their faces were drawn with fear, their whispers barely audible over the hum of distant machinery. "They've already taken 6 men," one of the elders muttered. "If we don't do something, more will disappear." Avelini, clench your fists. "We need to move carefully. Rash actions will only bring more bloodshed. And if we do nothing," another voice challenged, "they'll take everything, as they always do." Silence settled over the group. They all knew the truth. The Empire didn't stop until there was nothing left to take. Avelini finally spoke. "I'll help those who need shelter. Food, whatever we can spare." It was a dangerous promise, but she made it anyway. That night, as she tucked Rin into bed, she felt his small fingers curl around hers. His eyes, filled with quiet understanding, met hers. "You're helping them, aren't you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she kissed his forehead. "Sleep, my love." But Rin didn't sleep. Not that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why doing the right thing had to be so dangerous. Hashtag a shadow in the dark. Days passed. The tension in the village grew thicker, like a rope pulled too tight. More soldiers arrived, their presence an unspoken warning. A curfew was enforced. Supplies were rationed. Then, one evening, as Avellini prepared to sneak out with a bundle of food wrapped tightly in cloth, she heard it, the distant rhythmic march of imperial boots, moving with precision of a storm rolling in. A knock, loud, commanding, echoed through their home. Rin froze, his breath catching in his throat. Avellini's face remained calm, but he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes before she masked it. She motioned for him to hide beneath the floorboards. "No matter what happens, stay silent," she whispered. Rin obeyed, pressing himself into the darkness just as the door swung open. 3 soldiers stepped inside, their visors concealing their eyes. The officer in the center, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, took a slow step forward. Avellini Rhine. She didn't flinch. "How can I help you, officer?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "It has come to our attention that certain dissidents have received aid in this sector. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Avellini met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm a seamstress, sir. I mend uniforms. I don't involve myself in imperial matters." A long pause stretched between them. Then the officer took another step forward, so close that Avellini could smell the metallic tang of his armor. "If you're lying, you'll hang." His voice was soft, almost casual, but the threat was as cold as the void of space. Avellini didn't blink. "I understand." The officer held her gaze for another moment before nodding to his men. They turned, stepping back into the night. The door shut. Silence fell. Ren didn't move until his mother lifted the floorboard and helped him out. He clung to her, his small body trembling. "Mother, they know." She held him close. "Not yet, but they will." And in that moment, Ren understood something he never had before. His mother wasn't just kind. She wasn't just strong. She was a threat. And threats to the Empire never lasted long. The days after the soldiers' visit were filled with a fragile silence, stretched thin over the village like a thread on the verge of snapping. No one spoke openly of what had happened. Yet Avellini could feel the shift in the air, the way people avoided her gaze, the way conversations died when she walked past. The Empire had planted suspicion among them, turning neighbor against neighbor, fear making traitors out of men who once called each other brothers. She continued her work, mending uniforms with steady hands, pretending not to notice the shadows that lurked behind every corner. But she knew it was only a matter of time before the noose tightened. And then, one night, it did. Hashtag the sun's fear. Ren had always feared the soldiers, but never like this. Never with the kind of dread that crawled beneath his skin, whispering of something inevitable. His mother acted as if nothing had changed, but he could see it in her eyes, how they flickered to the window more often, how she moved through the house with the quiet caution of someone waiting for the end. It happened when the stars were high in the sky, their glow casting pale light over the dirt paths of the village. A sudden, sharp knock shattered the quiet of their small home. Not the forceful, demanding knock of an Imperial patrol, but something worse, calculated, deliberate. Avellini stood, her expression unreadable. She pressed a finger to her lips, a silent command for Ron to stay put, and moved toward the door. When she opened it, she did not gasp. She did not flinch. But Ren did. A man stood in the doorway, his figure draped in the Empire's dark uniform, though something about him felt different. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken but sharp, his presence more like a vulture than a soldier. He did not raise his voice, did not shove his way inside. Instead, he simply smiled, and that was worse than all the violence Ren had ever seen. "Avellini Rhine," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "I believe we have unfinished business." Hashtag the betrayal. Ren did not know how long the conversation lasted. He only knew that his mother stood firm, her shoulders squared, her words measured. He heard little from where he sat crouched beneath the old wooden table, but he understood enough. Someone had spoken. Someone had given her name. The Empire had come for her. When the man finally left, disappearing into the night like a shadow, Avellini closed the door with deliberate care. then turned to face her son. "We have to go," she said. Ren didn't ask why. He already knew. Hashtag flight into the night. They left everything behind, their home, their possessions, even the warmth of familiarity. The village was no longer safe. Nowhere was. The cold bit at their skin as they hurried through the narrow alleys, moving with the silence of hunted prey. Ren's heart pounded in his ears, his small hand clutching his mother's tightly as they navigated the darkness. He had never run like this before, never felt the weight of real danger pressing down on his shoulders. They reached the outskirts of the village, where the ruins of an old watchtower stood crumbling against the night sky. Avellini pulled Ren behind it, pressing a hand against his back as they crouched low in the tall grass. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the wind, the distant chatter of insects. Then came the sound of boots. Torches flared in the distance, casting flickering light over the streets they had just abandoned. Soldiers moved with cruel precision, sweeping through the village in search of their prey. The man from before was with them, walking slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the hunt. Ren held his breath. Beside him, his mother remained motionless, her grip on his hand firm but not panicked. She was waiting, watching. Then, softly, she leaned in. "We need to get to the mountains," she whispered. "There's a passage the rebels use. If we can reach it, we'll be safe." Ren nodded, swallowing his fear. He did not ask how she knew this. He did not ask why she had never told her before. Right now, questions did not matter. Hashtag captured. They moved quickly, slipping to the tall grass, keeping low. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, indifferent to the terror unfolding below. They almost made it. A shout rang out. Over there. Torches swung in their direction, and before Ren could react, his mother had shoved him forward. "Run!" she hissed. He did. His feet pounded against the dirt, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the trees. Behind him, he heard the chaos erupt. Shouts, the crash of bodies colliding, his mother's sharp, defiant cry. Then a sound cut through the night. A crack, sharp as thunder. Ren skidded to a stop. He turned. His mother was on her knees, her hands bound behind her back. A soldier stood over her, rifle raised, the barrel glinting beneath the torchlight. Ren took a step forward, his chest heaving. "No!" A blow struck the back of his head. Stars exploded in his vision. The ground tilted. Darkness swallowed him whole. Hashtag the journey to death. Ren woke to the rattling of metal chains. His head throbbed, his vision blurred. It took him a moment to realize where he was. Inside a transport vehicle, its walls cold and unyielding. His hands were bound, his body aching. And then he saw her. Avellini sat across from him, her expression calm despite the bruises forming along her cheek. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ren broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His mother smiled, though there was sorrow in it. "Don't be, my love." Tears welled in his eyes. "What will they do to us?" She hesitated only briefly. "They will make an example of us." The words were quiet, but they hit like a blade. Ren's hands curled into fists. "Then we have to escape." Avellini reached forward, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Not this time." He shook his head fiercely, refusing to accept her answer. "But you said—" "I know what I said." She cupped his face in her hands. Her touch warmed despite the cold around them. "Listen to me, Ron. No matter what happens, you must remember who you are. Do you understand?" His throat tightened. "Mother, you must survive," she continued, her voice urgent now. "For all those who cannot." Ren bit his lip, forcing himself to nod. But inside, something burned. Something unfamiliar. The transport jolted to a stop. Outside, the voices of soldiers called out, their words carrying the weight of finality. Ren knew, with a terrible certainty, that this was the end. But as he looked at his mother, as he saw the fire in her eyes, he realized something. Perhaps the end was only the beginning. The metal doors of the transport hissed open, flooding the dim interior with the harsh glare of artificial lights. The cold night air carried the scent of rust and scorched stone, signs of imperial occupation. Ren's breath came in shallow gasps as he squinted against the brightness, his wrists aching from the tight bindings. Avellini stepped down first, her movement slow but unwavering. Even in captivity, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Ren tried to follow, but rough hands yanked him forward. He stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing. "Move," a soldier barked. Ren's heart pounded as he took in their surroundings. They had been brought to a military outpost, a stark fortress of steel and concrete built into cliffs overlooking a barren valley. Towering watchtowers loomed overhead, their mounted cannons sweeping the horizon like mechanical sentinels. The walls were lined with banners bearing the Empire's sigil, a crimson star, fractured by a blade. A crowd had gathered in the courtyard, villagers forced from their homes, their faces etched with fear. The Empire wanted witnesses. This wasn't just an execution. It was a message. Hashtag a mother's strength. Avellini and Run were dragged to the center of the platform where an officer stood waiting. A man clad in a high-ranking uniform, his insignia glinting beneath the floodlights. Ren recognized him immediately. The scarred officer who had come to their home. The man regarded them with a calculated smirk. "Avellini Rhine," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You stand accused of treason against the Galactic Empire." Silence fell over the crowd. Somewhere in the back, a child whimpered before being hushed. Ren's pulse roared in his ears. He turned to his mother, expecting her to beg, to plead for mercy. She did neither. Instead, she lifted her chin and met the officer's gaze without fear. "If feeding the hungry and sheltering the desperate is treason," she said, her voice steady, "then I accept your charge." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officer's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before twisting into something cruel. "A noble sentiment," he mused, "but misguided." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she and Ren could hear. "You could have lived, Avellini. All you had to do was submit." Avellini smiled, a small, defiant thing. "Submission is just another word for death." The officer's expression darkened. He turned to the soldiers. "Prepare the boy." Ren stiffened his hand, seized him, yanking him away from his mother. "No!" he cried, struggling against their grip. Avellini's eyes widened. "Leave him out of this. He's just a child." The officer chuckled. "A child who will grow to become a problem." He crouched before Run, his voice dropping into a mockery of kindness. "You remind me of my own son. Proud, stubborn, but pride can be broken." Ren spat at him. The man's smile vanished. A sharp crack echoed as the back of his hand struck Ren's face, sending him to the ground. Avellini lunged forward, but the soldiers held her fast. "You don't have to do this," she hissed. The officer straightened. "Oh, but I do." Hashtag the breaking point. Ren barely registered the pain in his cheek. He only felt the cold, the anger, the helplessness clawing his insides as he was forced to his feet. The soldiers dragged him toward a metal post at the center of the courtyard, securing his wrists in thick restraints. The officer turned to Avellini. "You say fear is the Empire's greatest weapon." He gestured toward Ren. "Then let's see how much fear you can endure." A soldier stepped forward, a pulse whip coiled in his hand. Ren's breathing turned ragged. He clenched his fists, bracing for the sting of agony. But his mother's voice cut through the chaos. "Wait!" Everything stopped. Avellini's gaze burned with desperation. "Take me instead." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Begging at last?" She shook her head. "Not begging, bargaining." She glanced at Run, her expression softening. "He's just a boy. He doesn't deserve this." Ren felt his throat tighten. "Mother, don't." "Hush, my love." Her voice wavered, just a little. "Close your eyes." The officer considered her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well." The restraints around Ren's wrists were unlatched, and before he could protest, Avellini was pulled forward in his place. She met his gaze one last time as the soldiers forced her to kneel, and then the whip cracked. Hashtag a lesson in blood. Ren had heard screams before. He had heard the cries of the oppressed, the wails of mothers mourning their stolen sons, the last gasp of those who dared to resist. But he had never heard his mother scream. Each slash cut deep, the air thick with the sickening scent of scorched flesh. Avellini did not beg. She did not plead. Even as pain racked her body, she bit down her agony, refusing to give the Empire the satisfaction of her suffering. But Ren saw the way her hands trembled. He saw the blood soaking through the tattered remains of her tunic, and something inside him shattered. The fear that had gripped him for so long twisted, hardened into something else, something unyielding. Hatred. When the lashes finally stopped, Avellini's body slumped forward, her breath shallow. The officer turned to the crowd. This is what happens to traitors. He looked back at Ren. You should remember that. Ren met his gaze, his hands curling into fists. I will never forget. Hashtag the execution. The officer drew his sidearm, its barrel gleaming beneath the floodlights. Ren's blood turned to ice. No! He took a step forward, but the soldiers blocked his path. You said she'd live. The officer sighed. I lied. He raised a weapon. Avellini lifted her head, her gaze locking onto her son's. There was no fear in her eyes, only love. And then the shot rang out. Avellini crumpled. Ren's scream tore through the night. Hashtag, a new purpose. The world blurred. Sound became distant, movement sluggish. He was dimly aware of the crowd dispersing, the soldiers shoving him aside, the officers' parting words. Something about mercy, about sparing him. But Ren felt nothing. He knelt beside his mother's body, his hands trembling as he reached for her. Her warmth was already fading, stolen by the unforgiving night. A single tear traced down his cheek. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze toward the sky. The stars had never seemed so cruel. His mother had always told him that fear was the Empire's greatest weapon. But she had been wrong. It was rage. And one day, the Empire would feel his. The world after his mother's death felt like an empty shell, silent, cold, and unrelenting. Ren had been left alive, but it did not feel like mercy. It felt like a curse. The soldiers had abandoned him on the outskirts of the village, their cruelty complete. They expected him to wither, to break beneath the weight of grief. But Ren did not break. He burned. For days, he wandered aimlessly, his mother's final words echoing in his mind. Survive. The boy who had clung to her hand in fear was gone. In his place was something new, something shaped by loss, hardened by injustice. The Empire had taken everything from him, but they had made one mistake. They had left him alive, and he would make them regret it. Hashtag a flicker in the darkness. Ren found himself in the mountains, his body weakened by hunger, but his resolve unshaken. He followed the winding paths his mother had once spoken of, the same routes used by the rebels, the ones the Empire feared. It was near dawn when he stumbled upon them, a group of men and women, clad in mismatched armor and tattered cloaks, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Their weapons were drawn before he could even speak. A man stepped forward, his face lined with years of war. You're far from home, boy. Ren met his gaze without flinching. I have no home. The man studied him for a long moment. And what do you want? Ren clenched his fists. I want to fight. A murmur ran through the rebels. Some scoffed, others looked away. You're just a child, the man said. Ren's jaw tightened. There was silence. Then a woman from the group stepped forward. Who are you? Ren hesitated, the weight of his old name pressing on his tongue. That name belonged to a boy who had lived in the village, the boy who had feared the Empire. That boy was dead. He took a slow breath, steeling himself. My name is Run Rhine, he said, his voice steady, and I will be the Empire's reckoning. Hashtag a new path. The rebels took him in, though not without hesitation. He was young, untrained, a liability. But Ren had something they did not, an unshakable hatred, a fire that would not be extinguished. He threw himself into the training, pushing his body beyond its limits, refusing to be left behind. The blade became an extension of his hand. The rifle became a part of his arm. And pain? Pain became nothing more than an inconvenience. Every strike he delivered, every shot he fired, he imagined the face of the officer who had killed his mother. He imagined the empire crumbling beneath his hands. He learned quickly, too quickly, and when the time came for his first mission, there was no hesitation. Hashtag the empire bleeds. The target was a small imperial outpost, a supply station nestled in the valley. The rebels moved like shadows, striking with ruthless efficiency. Ren was among them, his hands steady, his heart pounding with something close to exhilaration. He had never killed before. That changed that night. The first soldier didn't even see him coming. The blade slid between the armor plates. A sharp gasp escaping the man's lips before Ren withdrew the weapon. The second went down with a shot to the chest, his body crumpling in the dirt. Ren felt nothing. No regret, no hesitation, only purpose. By dawn, the outpost was in ruins, its banners torn, its supplies scattered. The Empire had lost a foothold, and Ren had taken his first steps toward vengeance. Hashtag the legacy of the fallen. As the rebels gathered in the aftermath, the leader approached Ren, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You did well," the man said. Ren wiped the blood from his blade. "It's not enough." The leader nodded. "It never is." He studied Ren carefully. "This fight will consume you." Ren met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let it." The man sighed. "And what will you do when the war is over?" Ren hesitated. The war would never be over. Not for him. Not until the Empire burned. He thought of his mother, her quiet strength, her unwavering defiance. She had fought not for vengeance, but for hope. For a moment, doubt flickered in his chest. But then he thought of the officer's smirk, the crack of the gunshot, the way the Empire had taken and taken until there was nothing left. No, hope was for those who had the luxury of mercy. Ren had none. He sheathed his blade and looked toward the horizon, where the Empire's banner still stood, waiting to be torn down. "I will do what must be done." And with that, he turned away, walking into the night. The boy who had once feared the Empire was gone. In his place stood something else. Something the Empire would soon learn to fear.